So hi everyone, my name is Ilana Ullman. I'm a policy and communications analyst with Ranking Digital Rights, which is a nonprofit research initiative that I'll talk a little bit about. But I'm going to be talking today about some of our research findings and what they tell us about what companies are doing with our data, and also what they're not telling us and what they could be doing better. So just for a bit of context, a lot of which I'm sure is already familiar to the people in the room, but internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies play a huge role in our everyday lives. And they also collect a huge amount of our personal information. However, these companies really aren't telling users enough about what they're doing with this information, how they're collecting it, what they're collecting, what they're sharing, what they're retaining. Privacy policies contain some of this information, but they come with their own set of problems. So, like the GIF illustrates, it's a lot of paper to get through. People don't necessarily have time or the ability to read through all of them. Sometimes privacy policies will change without notice to users. And they also don't contain all of the information about what the company is actually doing with your data. So how can we evaluate how well these companies are protecting our privacy? And to start with, what do we know about what they're doing and what don't we know? So as I mentioned, Ranking Digital Rights is a nonprofit research initiative, and we put out a report called the Corporate Accountability Index. And we look at public disclosures and policies from 22 different internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies that are based and used by people all over the world. So when people say no one actually reads terms of conditions and privacy policies, actually we and our team of researchers do. We comb through all of their publicly available documentation and we evaluate how well they are explaining what they're doing around different policies that affect users' freedom of expression and privacy rights. And to do that, we use a methodology that's made up of 35 indicators that are broken into what we call 3 categories. So we look at governance, which is the corporate commitment to human rights, specifically privacy and freedom of expression, as well as different freedom of expression and privacy issues. So on the freedom of expression side, there are content policies, how they respond to government requests for content takedowns, their identity policies for users. On the privacy side, different things like responding to government requests for user information or use of encryption. And I won't get into the full results of our report, but if you're interested in those or in reading the methodology, I would encourage you to go to our website. It's rankingdigitalrights.org/index2017, has the full index, the full data set. You can download and read all the comments as to which companies scored and why they did that. And just to give you an idea of the companies that we're looking at, this map has their headquarters. It doesn't actually measure global reach. As I mentioned, these are used by people all over the world. But we also look at companies that are based all over the world and operating in different legal environments. So, for example, we look at Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, other companies that are based in the US, but we also look at companies like Yandex and Mail.ru that are based in Russia, Tencent and Baidu in China, telecommunications companies like Vodafone, Orange, Etisalat, and we look at different services that these companies offer. So for example, for Facebook, we're looking at their policies for Facebook, the social network, as well as Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp, which are all owned by the same company. So again, I won't get into the full results, but just to give you an idea of how companies performed overall, the highest score was 65%, which was Google, and Microsoft was close behind with 62%. And the lowest score was Ooredoo, which is a telecommunications company based in Qatar that scored only 5% out of 100. And it actually was the only company to receive no credit on any of our privacy indicators. They didn't have a privacy policy that was available online. They only had one that covered their website. It didn't cover any of the telecommunication services that we were looking at. And so the average altogether of all the companies overall was maybe about 33%, which is failing by any means. And so all companies across the board really have a lot of room for improvement on transparency. Today I'm going to be focusing more specifically on our findings that relate to user data. and the set of indicators that we look at that measures that. So first, just as context, we define data as any data that is connected to an identifiable person or may be connected to such a person by combining data sets or utilizing data mining techniques, which is a pretty expansive definition. It might be different from how a company views identifiable versus non-identifiable data. But as mentioned in the definition, we do this because it's possible using different data sets to get a picture of an individual from what you might think is anonymized data. So this is the set of indicators out of the privacy category that look at companies' practices for handling or policies around handling user information. So we look for them to disclose information about collecting user information, what they're collecting and how, sharing of user information, specifically who they're sharing with, what the names of the companies they're sharing with, as well as why they're collecting it and sharing it. We look for information about how long they're retaining the user information. And we also look for them to disclose ways that users can access and control their own information. So can they tell a company, stop collecting these pieces of information from me or delete them from a sort of activity log? And we also look for disclosure about what user information internet companies are collecting from third parties. And so this is what that looks like. These are the average scores for all companies on this set of indicators. And a couple things about what this tells us is that, overall companies really aren't telling us enough. The highest average indicator, which was collection of user information, P3, was 45%, which, as before, is still a failing grade. But companies on average did tend to disclose more information about collection and sharing of user information than they did on retention of user information, which was only 13%, which is the lowest in this category. Which is also pretty concerning because as a user, if you don't believe a company is respecting your privacy enough and you want to delete your account and delete their access to your information, it's not always clear if and when they'll actually do that. The two indicators that look at users' control and access to their own information are also pretty low, P7 and P8, which again, if companies really aren't disclosing enough generally about what information they're collecting, they're disclosing even less about the specifics of what information they're collecting on a given individual. So I won't go into each indicator in too much detail, but to give you a sense of how companies perform on a couple of these, this is our indicator on collection of user information. So we're looking for companies to disclose what type of user information they collect, how they collect that user information for each type of information they collect, and do they clearly disclose that they limit collection to what is directly relevant and necessary to accomplish the purpose of the service. So not just collecting it because they can, they need a reason to collect it. And although, as I mentioned, companies performed fairly poorly overall, what's interesting is that Kakao, a South Korean company, actually performed pretty well on this, especially compared to the other companies we evaluated. They had 89% as compared to a company like Google that had 60%, or Apple, which had 29%. And again, the important thing to remember here is that we're measuring transparency. We're measuring what companies say they do about their practices. We're not measuring the practices themselves necessarily. So if a company has this really amazing data minimization program in place, but they're not telling their users about it, and they're not including it in their privacy policy or other public documentation, their users and the general public have no way of knowing that it exists and that their data is being protected in that way. So they wouldn't get credit in our methodology. And what's interesting about Kakao is that we also do a separate layer of research, which we call jurisdictional analysis, that looks at the legal environment that a company is operating in, and it tries to determine if there are perhaps regulatory reasons why they're underperforming, or that requires transparency on certain things. And we found that in some instances, Kakao's strong performance on these indicators is due to the strong privacy regulatory environment in South Korea, but that also in some cases that they were going above and beyond the minimum legal requirements for companies. So it's not just the legal environment that causes, that results in positive disclosures. And then also on sharing of user information, again, Kakao tended to do better than the other companies we looked at. And in their privacy policy, they actually have a sort of table where they break out the names of each company that they share user information with, what information they're sharing with them and why, and how long those companies can retain it for, which is the really detailed granular disclosure that we're looking for. So to give you an example of more insufficient disclosure and what this research actually looks like when we're evaluating the policies, this is for Google on the issue of retention of user information. So if you want to delete your Google account and you want to know when they will delete all your data, or if they will delete all your data, and you go to the page about deleting your Google account, it says, deleting your Google account affects all data associated with that account. It doesn't actually say it deletes all data associated with that account, just that it affects all data. And then if you go down to step 1, what happens when you delete your account? It says, once you delete your Google account, you'll no longer be able to use the following. It doesn't say anything about, the company not being able to access the following. It just says that you will not be able to use it. And then the most detailed information we were able to find that maybe addresses this issue was in this help page that says if you deleted your Google account, you have about 2 to 3 weeks to recover it. So that could be because it's deleted after that time, but it's not explicitly stated, so it's not clear, so they wouldn't have received credit for this element. And on the issue of users' control over their own information, this is an example of Facebook's disclosure. So Facebook has a page called Privacy Basics, and they have these different privacy controls that use this really empowering language. It says, you have control over who sees what you share on Facebook. You're in charge, learn how you're in control of your Facebook experience. It sounds like they're giving users a lot of control over information collection. But this is specifically for information that a user shares on Facebook and content they post. It doesn't directly deal with information the company itself is collecting from them. And so in their data policy, in the section, how can I manage or delete information about me, it says, you can manage the content and information you share when you use Facebook through the activity log tool. But when you go to the activity log, it is really only for things that you've posted or shared. And the options that you're given, for example, for this event that I said I was interested in, the only options I have are whether or not it's allowed on my timeline. It's not really clear, if you can access all the information Facebook has on you, and if you can select certain things that you don't want them to collect. The options that you're given more relate to things that you choose to share on the service, which isn't the disclosure that we're looking for. So what did our research tell us? I've mentioned a couple of these items already, but overall, companies really aren't disclosing enough on their user data policies, although they did tend to disclose slightly more about what they collect and for what purpose than about what they share and for how long they retain it. And as I mentioned, that data retention disclosure was particularly low. Good data protection or data privacy law also doesn't necessarily mean a company will have adequate disclosure on how it handles user data. So if, for example, a company says, well, we're headquartered in country X, which has really strong data protection laws and requirements for how we handle user data, and of course we're in compliance with the law, that's great, but a user shouldn't need to be an expert in data retention law to know how their rights are being respected. And companies should do a better job of disclosing how they apply practices that are in accordance with that legislation. So we also provide recommendation for companies in addition to our findings. The methodology, I think, does a good job of laying out a roadmap for how companies can improve their transparency. And overall, we would recommend that companies provide users with a more comprehensive picture of the life cycle of their personal information. So again, everything from collection to use to sharing to retention and eventual deletion. Companies should disclose their practices for each type of information they're collecting through the whole data life cycle, as well as the purpose for collection and the purpose for sharing. And so I won't read this giant wall of text, which is also in the methodology, but just to give you an idea, we are looking for, as I mentioned, very granular disclosure on this. So for example, for information sharing, it's not enough to say we may share your information with our advertising partners. That's not an exhaustive list. It seems that the company might share it with additional partners, and it doesn't name those partners. So a user should be able to look up the corresponding privacy policies of each of these companies that their data is now being sent to. So we look for specific names as well as exhaustive lists. And again, this is all in the methodology if you want to take a look at that. And we also have recommendations for governments, because governments also have the ability to encourage companies to be more transparent about their practices. And their laws and regulations should at least enable, if not require, companies to respect user rights first and foremost. But they also have the ability to develop more effective data protection regimes, while still ensuring they don't have unintended consequences for freedom of expression, and consulting with technical experts in civil society to make sure that's the case, as well as requiring companies to clearly disclose full lifecycle information and to give users control over the collection and sharing of their information, and to disclose how users can actually do that. So I won't actually take questions now since we're moving to the next presentation, but if you have any later, please let me know. And again, please visit our website if you want to read more about our report. Thanks.